Welcome to this video on Karl Marx. And the last time we were talking about Hegel, I was already trying to transition to Marx. And the difficulty of talking about Marx these days is that the entire pattern in which one can see historical materialism, or the materialist conception of history, the entire pattern itself is already dead. The idea that society transitions from one stage to the next, and that, say, the common pattern of from primitive communalism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism, and then from capitalism we move from socialism to communism. That pattern is dead, and it's kind of hard to suggest to use it as a theory on which to build on when you create a historical narrative, because the ending was already given, and all you have to really do is shape data in order to make the narrative go towards that ending, which is very wrong to so many degrees. And as I've said in the lectures, in the class lectures, we cannot simply pretend that 1989 did not happen. We cannot keep on thinking of Marx as this ideologue who wants to create this perfect world of bringing heaven on earth. We cannot simply do that. But even if 1989 happened, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and in some sense the proof that once and for all Marx's ideas are not entirely accurate, especially when it doubles with prophecies and trying to create or to pave the way for a future. There was no socialist arrangement in the state machinery. There was no withering away of the state, and there was never ever a communist society. That is clear. So today, instead of giving you a review of historical materialism based on those stages, I would rather present the basics of Marxism, so to speak, by presenting you Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. I'm not going to explain who Feuerbach was and what happened with the post-Hegelian struggle between idealists and materialists. The idealists, of course, thinks that ideas comes first. Materialists would think that matter comes first. That's an oversimplification, but more or less that's where the opposite poles were at. I think I've already alluded to the idea that even Hegel himself, when he was trying to explain his philosophy, it's kind of really difficult to simply place him under the banner of idealism, because there are materialist elements to Hegel's thinking, except that Hegel would simply somewhat explain that the idea of matter and the idea of movement in matter are in themselves ideas. So anyway, so I will not be talking about how history was interpreted as it moves from primitive communalism to slavery to feudalism, and then from feudalism to capitalism. You'll have more of that if you're going to have a review of your Western civilization, because Marxist history, from that from the point of primitive societies to the point of, say, the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. Marxist history is basically just world history in general, or Western history in general. So there's no difference. What Marx really, let's just say, failed to establish was how do we move from capitalism to socialism, socialism to communism. It's not very, very clear. Although we saw, as I've said, in 1989, that that project should be set aside for a bit, or maybe for a while, or for a very long while, because it failed. So today, I will just be presenting Marx's thesis in Feuerbach, and hopefully we can see how does one interpret society and history in general when we are dealing with Marx, or what is in its basic form the basic Marxist idea of how to interpret society. Now I'm really calling this one Hegel to Marx because we've been talking a lot of Hegel, especially Hegel and Lacan in class. And once we move from Hegel to Marx, what are the things that we should change in the way we think, in the way we create narratives in history, or what are the changes when we try to interpret what consciousness is all about? Well, for the most part, we've been talking about dialectics in our head. The split always happens in our head. And I hope you can recall the idea of this Hegelian idea of the absolute is subject. Because what I was really driving at when I was trying to emphasize absolute is subject is that there's not really just a triad. As what Slavoj said, I think in one of the conferences, or in one of his lectures, he said, Hegelians should really try to count more than 3. It's not just a triad. And it's nuanced in a sense that you cannot really structure it as a triad at all. And I hope you know what I mean. But there, the dialectics is played simply within consciousness. Marx wanted to transform that. So instead of the dialectics playing inside our head, the dialectics is or has to be manifested within social behavior. Excuse me, within the mechanics of social classes. So we see the dialectics happening at the level of social classes, therefore, when we see the oppositions of opposing consciousnesses, so to speak. As one class represents this kind of ideology, and the other one also representing some other form of thinking. And instead of a cunning of reason that somehow creates and determines this flow of history to be placed in a pattern, where one event leads to another, where the dialectics is played again by the simple act of reason. Instead, we transform, take out of the intellectual realm and place it into the actual realm, what the dialectics is all about. So if you recall in Hegel, we were talking about when out of objective reality, we're living in it. Once we come to a point of realization, we therefore see things, and then we begin to relate things. And when we do that, the cunning of reason, we are transporting experiences towards an intellectual realm. Well, what Marx is doing is, that's not really enough. In order for you to really demonstrate that you have understood what you are talking about or what you've realized, then you have to manifest whatever was in that intellectual realm towards the actual realm, so to speak. So the canon of reason, because the dialectics is now based on social classes, and the canon of reason is now the class struggle. That's basically the point of Marx's infamous "The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles." And of course, that would mean that the Owl of Minerva is influenced by the material conditions of existence. As I've said many times, the Owl of Minerva did not emerge from the head of Zeus out of nowhere. It emerged developed. It has to be influenced. It's influenced by the material conditions of existence. Now, what does that mean? It means that actual life influences reason itself. Reason does not simply spread its wings. It spreads its wings at the setting of dusk. It is influenced by people around it. It is influenced by the existence of matter, people. It is influenced by economic conditions. It is influenced by material conditions, the modes of production, the means of production, and all of that. Economic forces. In the German ideology, Marx was quite clear. Before you can even philosophize, you must be you must be placed in a position where you can actually do philosophy. It's like what Nietzsche was trying to imply. Philosophy, of course, was a product of boredom. You must be you must be placed in a material condition wherein you can do philosophy. Now, in Hegel, we're looking at the retroactive effect. The performative retroactivity of reason was that it transforms necessities into contingencies. I mean, contingencies into necessities. What Marx will do with this is, what we call contingencies of everyday life is just basically what we see in the superstructural cultural level. What we see people do every day. But these actions are not necessarily, and this is where Marx becomes really deterministic. He was not so much deterministic when he was writing the thesis in Feuerbach, but he eventually became more deterministic when he begins to see that what we mistake as contingencies within society are actually influenced by economic conditions, economic forces, social arrangements, social relations, that beneath this superstructure is a base that is composed of the economic forces and how these economic forces shapes social relations. So you have the superstructure at the top, at the surface. That's what sometimes we consider as, or sometimes we mistake as, contingency. And of course, we have the base when we're speaking about economic forces, the economy itself, the history of economics, the mode of production, the means of production, and how the mode of production and the appropriation of the means of production, how the mechanism of these two really, in a very strong sense, affect how we organize our social relationship. So in that sense, necessity at the bottom is basically determining contingency. So what happens to Aufhebung? Aufhebung is now praxis or revolution. It's not simply sublation. This is what Marx said. You have to demonstrate the sublation by social action. And this is, of course, the very point of the thesis on Feuerbach. So I'm not going to dwell so much on each of the items of the 11th thesis, but hopefully this is a sort of reminder of what basic Marxist ideas look like. So in the first point, the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity practiced not subjectively. Now, what this idea means is that there's always a gap between how this what Marx calls the old materialists look at reality by segregating what we are as human beings and what is the objective reality itself. That there is somehow no connection between the two, that they are being examined in an almost metaphysical way, in which they're being segregated as two existing entities, and that they are simply interacting in some sense. Not in the way that Marx would want it to be, because Marx would want it to be that one should understand that this external objective reality that we're talking about, we are part of it. We are not outside of it. We are not two entities separated by this gap in which we begin to understand the world objectively. We begin to understand reality objectively, but we are basically within objective reality itself, influenced by it. And that this thing, this reality that we speak of, we are basically part of it. We are not standing in some kind of objective space or an objective standpoint wherein we can examine reality itself as much as we can. We are in it, we are influenced by it, and all our senses, our human activity, are part of it. And we should therefore examine not the human being in its depth, but in relation to this external reality. That's what Marx meant by subjectively. To see the connection, to see the relation, to see how much praxis changes that reality, and how that reality in turn influences our consciousness. So the question, therefore, of whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. In a literal sense, it is really a practical question. Without transforming the world around you, your objective truth means nothing. It's kind of like it's simply a product of human fancy. It can be a product of a simple exercise of the intellect. Without changing the world around you, without putting that one into practice, then you cannot really simply talk about human thinking. This human thinking must therefore change the world around it. It's not mere theory. It has to be put into practice. It's a practical question. The materialist doctrine concerning the changing of circumstances and upbringing forgets that circumstances are changed by men, and that it is essential to educate the educator himself. This doctrine must therefore divide society into two parts, one of which is superior to society. Okay, what this means, at least the first sentence, is that we have to understand that our consciousnesses are determined by so many things. Social relations, economic relations within society itself. And in that way, that's what Marx meant by educating the educator. We somehow think that we know everything. Just like in Hegel, that we have reached the peak, the absolute point, the absolute spirit. But this form of thinking in itself, as much as it wants to educate, is already educated by the material conditions of existence. And in this point, the idea of the ideal is actually a product of a split into thinking that if, therefore, this is the kind of society that I am in, then there must be something better than this, something more universal. The absolute is subject. Divide society into two parts. The other one is superior. The other one meaning that which we try to become. It's still very much Hegelian. And this is the example. Last time we were talking about Hegelian dialectics, wherein when we create the state, what we're actually still looking at in the formation and becoming of the state is still just this ideal notion of family, of undifferentiated unity, so to speak. So we ought to sublate everything towards that goal, towards that towards that dimension, which Marx would refer to as the Holy Family. After the earthly family is discovered to be the secret of the Holy Family, the former must then itself be destroyed in theory and in practice. What that means is we ought to destroy the absolute idea by making it reality. We have to push the absolute idea to the point wherein it no longer is just an idea, but it's already in practice. It's like the highest form of the Holy Family is the actual family that we create out of it, which is, of course, the state. So this is still very much Hegelian, but there's a very materialist twist to it. We're actually making things, not simply stopping from the idea of realization, but to realize it, not simply in our heads, but to realize it in terms of materiality. Put it into practice. Feuerbach, not satisfied with abstract thinking, wants contemplation, but he does not conceive sensuousness as practical, human sensuous. Okay, this theme in Thesis on Feuerbach is repetitive. It is as if the old materialists were simply looking at the human being. Yes, it's looking at the human being as a material, but it's looking at the material in the old metaphysical way, in which almost like depth psychology, wherein you consider a human being as a basic unit of analysis without looking that this basic unit of analysis is actually composed, let's just say, is constituted by so many relations in the socio-symbolic order. So abstract thinking and contemplation wants to look at human being almost like in the old Kantian way of in itself, as a basic unit. Marx wants us to see and do away with that this human being is actually a human being of relations. When you look at a human being, you're not simply looking at the essence, so to speak, because the essence for Marx is here, the essence, a kind of what he calls it here as the ensemble of social relations. So in the analysis, in Feuerbach's analysis of religion, he looks at the alienation of the human being from its own essence, blocked by religion, transplanted by a religious essence. But for Marx, this human essence, Feuerbach was successful in explaining that, but this human essence has to move on from this kind of metaphysical analysis, because the human essence is not somewhere found beyond the veil, beyond the curtain, because we're done with that when we're talking about Hegel. It has to be within the human being itself, not as something separate from the rest, as a single individual, but as an individual. Or let me put it this way, it's almost even a mistake to say individual. That the human being is actually a reality that is constituted by an ensemble of social relations. So when you are examining yourself, you're not just examining yourself alone, you're actually examining the very connections that you have within your community, the very relations that you have, the very material conditions that determine your thinking. All of that, that is represented as a kind of human essence. So the human essence is not somewhere out there. It's not covered in waters, plunged into this kind of iceberg model of psychic reality. No. The essence is out there. We are constituted by social relations. Feuerbach consequently does not see that the religious sentiment is itself a social product, and that the abstract individual whom he analyzes belongs to a particular form of society. And this is more or less related. So what he's trying to accuse Feuerbach of doing is that it would appear that the analysis of the old materialist is that I am me, there is external reality. External reality somehow blocks my way towards my own essence. that there are two entities in opposition, me and the external reality. In a sense, me and civic society. Civic, in a sense that, for Marx, civic means that there are groups of individuals somehow related together, but these are still individuals. What Marx is trying to do is trying to wake us up from this idea that there are individuals. There are no individuals in this sense. We are a product of relationships. We belong to a particular form, in a sense where we belong to a particular structuring of the mind, of consciousness, the way in which the base determines the superstructure. All social life is essentially practical. Well, that's quite clear. All mysteries which led theory to mysticism find their rational solution in human practice, in the comprehension of this practice. Now, what this means is that we simply dispel all this mysticism about the human being, about the human essence. Once we see what a human being does within his social life, what he actually does in practice, what his behavior is all about, what is the behavior reflected by these practices. This is basically like social life determines, or social consciousness determines consciousness in general. And in that, we can therefore, as what he's trying to say here is this mystical interpretations of human essence can be dispelled, can be done away with by a concrete examination of social life, of social practices, social structures, of social reality itself. Okay. Of course, the highest point reached by contemplative materialism, that is materialism which does not comprehend sensuousness as practical activity, is the contemplation of single individuals and of civil society. This is what I mean. For Marx, civil society is this kind of society that are composed of presumably individuals in and for themselves. That they are already complete individuals. That there's no lack in them. That they are complete and they're only alienated by forces within civil society. Because what civil society does is, in trying to relate one individual to the next, civil society imposes its own kind of prohibition towards that individual, and therefore the individual becomes alienated because of these impositions. But this is still based on the idea that there is individual civil society. For Marx, that's not really the case, because individuals are not complete. Individuals are not already formed. And this is where Marx's theory of alienation would really come from. We are always alienated, regardless of whatever societies we are. There may have been a kind of minimal alienation when we look at feudal society, but in capitalist society, that alienation is very much clearer, very much defined. So the idea here is we cannot look at simply individuals as if they have an entire reality of themselves, while at the same time looking at civil society as a reality within themselves. So the standpoint of old materialism is civil society, that in which individuals are being made to be related to each other. But the standpoint of the new materialism is human society or social humanity, meaning society as composed of social beings, not individuals within that has its own reality, but which reality is the very reality of the social itself. That is the standpoint of the new materialism. Well, basically what he said. We are an ensemble of social relations. And this is the last one. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. If you have the idea, if you have the truth, then deal with it by transforming the reality around you.